Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining. Let me just get my slideshow started here. Okay, here we go, and I'm going to make it a little bit larger. I'm in window mode, so I can switch back and forth between AscentialTest and the presentation. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about different types of custom reporting in AscentialTest. I'll talk about the custom report generation toolkit. I'll probably spend most of our time on that. But I'm also going to talk about generating a simple text-based output report. And then recently, it was earlier this summer, I was asked by one of our customers to produce an XML-based report in JUnit format for Azure DevOps integration. So I'm going to talk about that as well, in case anyone has the opportunity or the need to produce a report in an XML-based format. And then I'll also talk a little bit about our Jenkins report as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate on the custom report generation that's built right into AscentialTest. And I want to talk about the different components of that toolkit. The first one is maybe you've never noticed that when you right-click on Test Set over in the Project Explorer, this little pop-up comes up and there's this selection called Export Test Set. And so what that does is it's really something that you only need to do one time, because what it does is it produces a set of XML that could then be used by the designer, whoever's going to design the custom reports. It creates something called test set XML, and then a whole bunch of reports, or I should say files that are generated by the AscentialTest run. It collects those files as well, and we're going to have a look at those. Now, what I'm also going to talk about is this user-defined record that the user needs to create in order to produce all of the different items that you might want to include, or all the different information that you might want to include on your custom report. Then I'll talk a little bit about the part that the user has to do, the actual report generator. And I'll cover the user interface features inside of AscentialTest. So let's look first at the files that are generated by this test set export. So when you do a test set export, it generates a test set XML, which we're going to have a look at. And then it also creates a folder for all of the, for each test. So every single test that gets executed has a folder. And in that folder will be output XML, result XML, run XML, test XML, test.z, and then any PNG files that were created for image comparison. So if you took screenshot, if you did a comparison between two images, your baseline image, and then the actual image, and then any different images that are produced by AscentialTest, the differences between the baseline and the actual. So all of these files are produced when you do a test set export. Again, just so that the person who's designing the custom report will have all of the information available to them. Now, some of you might be familiar with some of these files, because these are not new files just for custom report generation. These files exist as part of an AscentialTest run, and if you've ever gone up to the Open App Data folder and then navigated into Run, you may have looked at these before. Sometimes you look at them just because there's a problem. You know, support might have directed you to take a look at any of these. But these files are also very useful for custom report generation. Now let's take a look at each one of the files. So this is the test set XML, and this one is specifically generated for custom generation. The other ones are not. This one is. And so you can see it's in an XML format. It's pretty easy to read. And this is a plan, and here's the name of the plan. And then the plan contains a couple of tests. And the XML tells you, well, is this an automated test or a manual test? What's the state? Did it pass the last time it was run? When was it started? When was it finished? Where was it run? Who was the user logged in? So basic information about each one of the tests that are in the test plan in this particular case. Now, some of these are a little bit detailed, but we don't have to concentrate too much on the actual specifics. I really just want you to get an idea of the kind of information that's available to you if you're going to develop a custom report. And again, now the output XML was not produced specifically for custom reports. It's useful for custom reports. And I should also point out that not all of the information in these files that are generated, not all of the information is going to be interesting to everyone, because everyone will have different requirements for the custom reports that they generate. But I think you'll find as you go through these files that it does have anything that you can really imagine wanting to include in a custom report. So in this particular one, you can see, we've generated, and by the way, some of the data here, you'll see in a little bit, is tied to a record that the user creates. So I created a record in the project that we're going to be looking at. In fact, let me show you that record right now. There's a record here called report steps. And that record is created by the user. And so the information that we wanted for this report included the step number, something called the actions performed, what we expected the result to be, the status of a step, the actual result, the desktop screenshot, if we needed to take one, a diff image, an actual image, a baseline image, and then how long it took to execute. So again, this is user defined. You can put any fields into this record that you want to, based on what your reporting requirements are. Now, if you keep that record in mind, the record we just looked at, you'll see that the output XML includes all of that information. So there's the structure of the record, and then here's the actual information that's generated. And remember, this is put out for every single test case. So for every single test case that's run, this information will be collected. And I'm going to show you in a little while how this information actually got into this output.xml file. The result.xml file, this again might be familiar to you. There's a result.xml and a run.xml. Okay, the result.xml includes the computer, the user, when it started, when it finished, and what its status was. The run.xml, the run date, again, the computer. Some of this is redundant information, as you can see. But AscentialTest needs this information as well. Remember, I said not all of these files were generated for custom reporting, but they're useful for custom reporting. This is test.xml. So again, for every test, here's the GUID. The name. And then information like here's the web browser type values and so forth. the run count, the run group. So these are all settings of attributes. Again, because some of this information might be interesting for folks that are going to be generating reports. Here's a picture of that record that I just showed you earlier. So this is my record. And here I'm showing you in this slide how some of that information, let's go back and look at the record, how some of that information is populated. So we have an instance of that record, and here's, the execution time. So we're getting when the test was actually executed. Anytime you see a writing to the record reporting steps, you know that that's an instance of that record that I showed you. And here is the information being assigned to the instance of that record. Same thing over here. So this was something we called verify output, verify image output. These are just example tests that we've been running in order to generate the report. Now, when the test is executed, you might be familiar with this already if you've done any, if you've ever used log data, you know that you can log any information to the results file. That's what log data does. And you can click on this little icon, and then this dialog box pops up. And if you think back on the record that I showed you earlier, you see this is the actual information that was generated during the execution of the test. Because during the test, remember I showed you back here, we're actually populating that record. And then at the conclusion of the test, we do a log data. And so the data actually gets written to this. It can be generated, or it can be viewed by clicking on this icon. And so all this data, as you'll see in a little while, is going to end up in the custom report. Now, what AscentialTest provides is a toolkit. And that toolkit, we've looked at the outputs that are available to you as the designer of the report. So part of the toolkit are those files that are produced. But then there's a part that you have to produce, because you notice that all of those files that we looked at were all in XML format. In most cases, it's not in all cases, but in most cases, what users decide to do with this kit is they're going to produce a report that ends up being an HTML report that you can view from your browser. And so what the user has to do is create something that will take the XML and transform it into HTML. Now, most people use XSLT, which is quite easy to use. But then you're also going to need a program, either a command or an exe, that will actually make a call in order to have that engine, that XSLT engine, produce the HTML. So this is the part that the user is responsible for. So the user needs to design the report. What is the report going to look like, given all that information that's available? And then you need to transform the XML into HTML or some other format. Once you do that, you're going to place your .cmd or your .exe in your app data local folder. And under reports. And just to kind of remind you, it's really quite easy to get to that because in AscentialTest, you go up to Options, Open App Data Folder, and you just navigate right here into Reports. And this is where you're going to put your CMD or your EXE. But that part is up to you, the user. Now I want to demonstrate it for you. So let me just kind of, I can leave this here. So I've got a little test set that I created, and it's going to execute some tests. And I purposely want one of the tests to pass and one of the tests to fails. And I should tell you, they don't really do anything. So you're not going to see anything going on the computer as they're run, because really all they're doing is they're comparing some images that I've created, and in this case I'm going to force the comparison to fail, and in this case the images are going to match, because when we look at the report I want you to see what a pass looks like and what a fail looks like. But I'm going to run it for you fresh, just so that we have fresh information. So I'm going to kick it off, and on my other screen you can't see the test runner is actually running, and it just completed the 2 tests. And so you see the tests, they've been executed. And you know, in this case, it passed, and in this case, it failed. And remember, I showed you that report step. So if I click on that, you can see this little dialog box pops up. And this is all the information that I wrote throughout the test into that record that I showed you. Let me just remind you of that before we look at the report. So here's the record. And then if we look at my tests, let's see. We can look at the you can see that, again, this is really more or less canned because I'm just forcing images to fail, or in some cases I want them, you know, I want them to actually compare. Now that I've actually run the test and generated a result, I can go up to the result menu and I can generate a custom report. Now, what you see here is you see the AscentialTest reporter, which is that CMD that I pointed to when I showed you in the options that we placed the actual CMD. Here's the output folder. This is where the actual report is going to be written. But if we click OK, you'll see that the report gets generated in a browser. Now, in this case, this is IE, just because that's the browser that we had used when we created this. Nowadays, you'd be using Edge or Chrome or Firefox or something like that. But you can see that the report is actually quite a nice looking report. And this is all, you know, can be formatted by you. You get to choose the layout of it, the colors and so forth as you're creating your the format of your report when you design the report. This particular report has drill down, so you know that from looking at the result in AscentialTest, I executed 2 tests, test 1 and test 2. And so here you see test 1 and test 2 listed. Remember the testing type, it was automated. This one passed when it ran. This one failed. Now we can drill down and you'll see each one of the steps that was executed. What was the expected results? Did the step pass or fail? What were the actual results? and you can see images as well. So here was the, let me drill down there again. That was the baseline image, and then here's the actual image. And in this case, the images actually match. So there's the baseline image and the actual image, and they're the same. And that's why it passed. Now let's look at one that fails. So let me just clean this up a little bit so that it'll be easier to see. So if we go to the second test that failed, this one ran only a single step. But you can see the image, there's a screenshot. So because it failed, it took a screenshot of my entire screen, which would include the other monitor that you can't see. So it took the entire desktop. Now there's my baseline image, and if you look really carefully, you notice that I purposely took out the trademark because I wanted to force a failure. Here's the actual image. There's the trademark. And then here's the diff image. And you can see the trademark is highlighted in red there because the diff shows what's different between the actual and the baseline. And then the bottom part of the report is basically the trace. Because there was an error, we've got the call stack and so forth. So, why would you want to produce this? Well, this is a report that is, beyond what AscentialTest provides by default. We don't have a standard report that provides this level of detail. You get this level of detail in AscentialTest if you're looking at the output, but we don't have a report that looks like this. And this particular user, this actually came from a user, by the way. This particular user wanted a report because they're very heavily into, in this case, into images. And I think it came out really nice. It's an attractive looking report. I modified it a little bit to use our colors and put our logo in it and so forth, but this was actually the initial work of one of our customers. There was one thing else that I wanted to show you. Let me see if I can find it really quickly. I wanted to find the log data. Here it is. So this is the step, this log data. That's the step that actually gets the results written out to, let's go back. That's why you can see it here. It's the log data. So it's very important when you're generating the custom report to call the log data, because if you don't call the log data, then it won't put all the information that you put into that record, into this data record here. You populated that record throughout the test, throughout the execution of the test, but the log data must be called in order to get that into the XML. It's not so important that that you can see it here. It's important if you want to look at it, and that's why we always echo it back to the results file. So log data was not put in place just for custom reports, but it does get the information into the output.xml. So it's very, very important that log data be called. Otherwise, that information would not get into the output.xml, and therefore it would not be available to the custom report that's being generated. So that gives you an overview of what's available in the custom report toolkit. Now we have a document that explains all of this. So if anybody is interested in that after the presentation, just send an email over to support.xenix.com, and then you can, you'll get a copy of that. And it charts along with what I've been explaining throughout the presentation so far. Now I want to talk about something actually a lot simpler. There are times when you might want to generate your own text-based report. And this is actually quite easy to do. It's much easier to do than the custom report that we just talked about, because with the custom report, you have to transform XML into HTML, and you need an executable to do that for you. But in this case, you have everything that you need right within AscentialTest, because as you know, we have a text file class already. And you can get that from the Actions Explorer. So for here, and let's just open up a step. I'll just create a new one. You're probably familiar with the text file class right over here in the Explorer. And if you want to open up a file and read and write to it, it's really a matter of just dragging and dropping. So you can use the text file class. You can create an action that will write the header information. I'm going to show that. You can write results within your test steps. And so here's a couple of examples. So in this particular one, I call this report file create test header. This step is writing the header of the report. And it's just using our text file class, because the text file class has open, read, write, close. And again, it's all drag and drop. So it's really quite easy to do. Here's something that a lot of people don't know. This question comes up a lot, and I have to admit, sometimes when I'm asked this question, I have to go look it up for some reason. I don't always remember this, but people do ask, how do you get the name of the current test? It's not really obvious, at least to me. The way you do it is you create an instance of the class test. That's the built-in class that we use to execute test. And you call a method called getCurrentTest. That assigns it to the variable of test. And then, this is the part that I find not so obvious, to get the actual name, you do a getType. GetType actually does return the name of the test. So that's how you get the name of the test. So here in this example, I'm doing a bunch of writes. I'm opening up the file. I'm writing the header, which is basically just the test name and when the test started. I'm calling a built-in function there called now. And then here, throughout the execution of the test, I continue to write to that same test. Now remember, you're doing append, not a write, because you want to append to the file. Otherwise, you're going to overwrite it every single time you call it. So you're going to want to be appending. Once you create the file, you're going to want to be appending to the file. Let's take a look at that. I want to show you what the file looks like. So here's the file that got generated. So there's the header that gets written for every single test. And then here's the information that was written during the execution of the test. So in this case, just each step, what its name was, whether it passed or failed. If there were errors, you can put in an error count. You can put the elapsed time things like that. You can put anything you want in here. This is really just an example. So quite easy to generate a report outside of AscentialTest just by writing to a text file. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about generating an XML-based report. Now, when I did this project, we did not have the new XML class in AscentialTest, and you don't either, because it's coming in 9.8. So those of you that have ever used our external XML library, you know that we've always shipped the library that we created back when we were consultants, before we even created AscentialTest, in order to read, write, parse, and manipulate XML. And it was never built in to AscentialTest. There's no documentation for it, but that's all changing now with 9.8. We actually built an XML class into AscentialTest. It's one of the 9.8 features. It's very similar to the REST class that we put in, the JSON class, I should say, that we put in two releases back. And so it's fully documented. I think it's much easier to use. The example that I'm going to show you was written in the old one because, well, you don't have the new one yet. And in case you wanted to go ahead and do it, I've given you an example of how to do it with the old one. It will be easier with the new XML class that'll be part of 9.8. So in this case, you'll see I've created a test to initialize the result file. So I have a separate test that will initialize the results file. And then I created an action to write the results in XML format that was prescribed by Azure DevOps in the JUnit format. So the format that I'm adhering to here is not my format. It's the format that Azure DevOps wants. And you'll see that I put this into my app state. I call it in the onFinish. And I had to make modifications to the app state for that test in order to get this all to work. So let me just kind of take you through what I did. This was not difficult to do, by the way. It didn't take me very long, even with the old XML class, which I think is harder to use than the new one. So I've created a piece of XML. And so I'm just writing the header to the XML. And I do a query to get the file name. So I've stored the file name in my project settings. And then I save and then destroy the XML. So all I've done so far is I've just created the file in the correct format. And you can see that what I did was I decided to create that as its own test. So you'll see this was a test. And I put the test in my plan. So it's got to be the first test in the plan in order to create the file itself. And there it is. And then what I do is I actually I write in XML format. I get the current test, what I just showed you a little bit ago. And I'm using that old XML class. I got the elapsed time, I got the name. I create a piece of XML again. So I write it into this buffer here. There's the name, the path, and the name of the file. So I'm loading it in. And then I'm creating a line in the newly generated file with the name and the elapsed time. And then whether or not if the test failed, so if I get a failed result, then I'm getting the error count and the error message. because that's what that particular format called for. So if there's a failure, that format wants the number of errors, and then the message. And I write that, I save it, and then again I destroy the XML. Now in my onFinish, that's where I call. That's where I make the call to the write test result in JUnit format. So that's what this was. This was the write test result in JUnit format. And I'm calling that in my test set. I'm sorry, in my app state. So this actually gets called at the end of every single test. And I'm passing it the path and the name. And it does the rest. Because as you know, we have all this information, right? In the test class, we already have all this information. Now, in order for this to work, you have to make a modification to your test class. This is something that maybe not many of you have ever gotten into before. But if you, because we're used to looking at our test in the high-level editor. But if you go into your app state in the source editor of AscentialTest, you will see the onStart and the onFinish function. We don't put the onException there because we don't normally expect people to override the onException. It's okay to do it, as long as you do it exactly the way I did it here. It's dangerous in that if you don't report the exception, if you forget to do that, you're never going to know that there's an error. So if you do this, make sure you're really careful about it. But I needed something in order to get all this to work. I needed to add the error message because that's not something that's available. So I created another variable, another member, and I call it sErrorMessage and set it to null. And then in the onException, which gets called automatically, don't have to worry about that, I assign to sErrorMessage whatever the error message was that was thrown. So it's always going to be the last error that's thrown in a test. So if your test halted, it'll be the only message, but you know sometimes there's more than one message that gets generated if the test continues to execute. So it's going to be the last one that was thrown that got it into the onException. And so that's how I get that, because I couldn't think of another way to do it. And so you can see here in my project data, I talked about this earlier, this is where I set that results path, and that's where I set the name of the file that I want to write to. And here's what it looks like. So once the file is generated, you can see I wrote it in XML format. And if the test passed, the only thing that the format really required was it just wants the name of the test and it wants the time that it was executed. But if it failed, then it's going to want the errors. Actually, in this particular case, I grabbed the message, but I don't need it here. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about Jenkins. So in Jenkins, if you're using our integration with Jenkins, oh, and by the way, so this would be useful to you if you were using our Azure DevOps plugin. So maybe you don't know that we have a plugin that's available in Azure DevOps, and it's in their marketplace. And so if you want to, as part of your builds, if you're using Azure DevOps, you can just install the AscentialTest plugin, and then with the plugin, now you've got this this JUnit format that I've written, and you don't have to go and recreate this. If you want what we created, again, just send an email to support and we'll send you what we've already created. Please don't spend the time to create something in JUnit format for Azure DevOps because we already have it. So if you're interested in it, just email to support. We'll send you the document on how to use the plugin, and along with it, we'll send you the that method that I just showed you that will write the results out in the JUnit format. So same goes for Jenkins now. So for Jenkins, we also have a plugin. So if you want to integrate your AscentialTest runs with your Jenkins builds, you can do that as well. And this actually came to us from a customer. And so what they did was they used the plot plugin inside of Jenkins. And so if you install the plot plugin, then you can write out the results. Well, I should say our Jenkins plugin automatically writes out the results in the format required by the plot plugin. So you don't have to do anything at all in order to use this. So I'm telling you about it, but you don't have to learn how to do it because we did it for you already. All you have to do is just install the plot plugin, and that's what it's called. It's just called plot. You install that in Jenkins and you install our plugin. This will happen automatically. You don't have to do anything at all. When you look at your dashboard inside of Jenkins, you'll see this little plots here. There's your plots plugin. And without you doing anything really at all except for configuring the plugin, there is a panel that you need to configure, and our documentation shows you how to do that. This kind of histogram automatically pops out. And so what this is showing you is the percentage of pass failed for every single one of your runs. So anytime you did a build, if it's all green, that means that all passed. And then if it's all red, it all failed. And then of course, in between, it's showing you the percentage of passed versus percentage failed every time you do a build and run the AscentialTest regression that's tied to your build. So that's available to you if you're a Jenkins user. Now, before I take questions, and we are going to have plenty of time for question and answers, folks have asked me if I would always, whenever we do this, talk about what's going on in the next release. So I'm going to take you through at least some of it. So the Azure plugin is available now. You don't have to wait for 9.8 to come out. We've done that since 9.7, but again, you don't have to wait. We've gotten several suggestions about our expanding and collapsing state in the Project Explorer. And we made a stab at it a while ago, but it wasn't perfect. I think you're going to be much happier with it now. So if you leave AscentialTest and you've got your Project Explorer exactly the way you want it, and then you come back in again, I think you'll be much happier in 9.8. Thanks goes out to Pete for suggesting that. So if you have a CEF now in a Power Builder application, we've always supported IE inside of a Power Builder application, but now we're supporting Chrome inside of a Power Builder application as well. So that's supported in 9.8. New lock icons. This is really convenient. So if you have, if you're using version control, then you used to have to go back over to the Project Explorer and lock your app objects files, your plans, your data tables. You don't have to do that anymore. We've given you those little lock icons like we do for steps and tests. So no more having to go find it in the Project Explorer. Finally, we've added click path and double click path to tree view. If you've got tree views, you've known in the past that it was always easy to select from a tree view, but then you had to kind of figure out how to double click in the place where the selection was made. So that's much easier now. Double click path is there. We created a click path just, to be sort of consistent, but select and click path pretty much do the same thing, except for click path does allow you to click somewhere along the item. So like say, for example, maybe there's an icon on the tree view that you need to click as opposed to just the text. ClickPath will allow you to do that. Same thing with double click path. You can click somewhere along it. If you don't specify where, it'll just hit the center like all of our clicks. But these do allow you a little bit more control. So that's really the only difference between select and click, is you can click in a certain place. Yes, Roke asked for this from Clemex. So now you can get the translation language at runtime. We're working on, there's several bug fixes in there as well that I didn't list. We're working on some issues right now with command line. You might know that if you execute the command line and if the machine that you were trying to connect to wasn't reachable, we actually didn't do anything. We didn't give you an error message. It looked like everything ran. So we're working on that right now. And we're working on finishing up the debugger. So that's what's coming in 9.8. After 9.8, we're going to be working on Edge and we're going to be working on Git. So those are going to be the two next big things that come down the pike after 9.8.